How's it going? And welcome to the Coffee and Scotch Esports Show. I'm your host, Bowman Shota, and today we're going to be talking about first-person shooters and their impact on the esports scene. Now, to go back in time a little bit, back when first-person shooters were finally getting that hardcore competitive scene, we have to go back to the early 2000s, and we have to look at Unreal Tournament, Quake, and Counter-Strike. Now, Unreal Tournament is my personal favorite. If you've been following me for a while, you know that that's where I got my competitive gaming start. Quake in the early 2000s was probably the most highest competitive skill level for first-person shooters. Like the amount of skill that those players had was just kind of insane, and honestly, like if they were in their prime today, would give a lot of people a good run for their money still. And obviously there's Counter-Strike, which, you know, Counter-Strike was your go-to for your non-fantasy type shooter, your more standard, your tactical, your real-world guns, all that stuff, because obviously with Quake and Unreal Tournament, you had the plasma cannons, the flat cannons, the guns that weren't real as far as, you know, modern standard technology, and it was definitely something that made a little bit of a contrast in your player base, because in the Quake and your Unreal Tournament, it was more about being a twitch shooter and your movement and your fast pace and using projectiles that weren't instantaneous, versus in Counter-Strike, all the guns, you know, the time from when the bullet left the barrel to when it hit, you know, the distance, there was almost no delay between that. Obviously there was the bullet spread and everything like that, so you had to have a certain level of skill in order to do that, but it was a different type of shooter. And you know, obviously Counter-Strike is still popular today. It's had its rough patches throughout the years, but you don't see Unreal Tournament, you don't see Quake in any hardcore competitive sense at the scale of Counter-Strike is. Now, as we move forward into today's era, it is important to point out that we've had other first-person shooters come along that have kind of taken their own place in the categories of competitive hardcore gamers. Obviously, we can't go anywhere without mentioning Halo. From a console standpoint, Halo clearly defined the competitive gamer in all of us, essentially, because it was one of those games that anyone could just jump in and play multiplayer. Multiplayer is where it really shined and really got the console world into the competitive first-person shooter video game world. Now, obviously, you know, especially recently, you have Call of Duty, which to me is a little bit surprising that the Call of Duty competitive scene has really taken off more on console than on PC, considering, you know, it is more difficult to aim and have that precision on a console controller than it is with a keyboard and mouse. You know, if you pit two pro-level players on Call of Duty versus someone in Counter-Strike, and you're just going a one-on-one battle with aim duels, you're more than likely going to see the PC player win because of the precision of the mouse. Now, not to discredit anyone in the console competitive scene, because that is still freaking amazing on how impressive their aim and their movement and everything is with the controller. But it is interesting to look at the Call of Duty scene and seeing how that's grown. You know, you have now Activision being proactive with their World Tour coming out, and they're really trying to ramp up the esports side of the Call of Duty scene. And it'll be interesting to see where that plays out and how that plays out as far as the viewership, because that's the one thing Call of Duty scene has suffered. Even though it's been blockbuster hits as far as sales-wise, you know, the viewership from the esports side has suffered. And you know, just a little speculation out there. I know there is the whole Infinite Warfare coming out later this year, and they have the remastered of Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, which personally I think, as far as from a competitive gaming side, was one of the best multiplayer shooters out there. The weapons were generally balanced. Obviously there are some flaws in it which they can fix, but there was even to the point where there was the pro mod that was created for the professional scene for that Modern Warfare, and unfortunately that scene got lost in the fact that there was Call of Duties every single year, which also I do believe is a little bit of a problem for the Call of Duty franchise as far as maintaining that competitive gaming scene. It's definitely something that they have to take into consideration, and I wonder if that is something they are considering with the remastered Modern Warfare, because personally I would love to see them implement like that pro mod again, and you could have a solid game that they have consistency over years. I mean, you take a look at Counter-Strike, and essentially it's the same game with just upgraded graphics and upgraded, you know, little tweaks, and obviously they've had patches to balance things and everything like that, but like, you know, Dust has been a map forever. there's lots of maps that have been staples within the Counter-Strike scene for years, many years, and that's the key word here as far as first-person shooters in esports. First-person shooters have been huge in a lot of areas of making esports what it is today. It's arguable that you have some of the best on-air talent in the Counter-Strike scene, and that comes from first-person shooter because a lot of these people have been involved for years, and I'm talking like almost 2 decades for some of these people. More than likely 10 to 15 years is your average range for a lot of these people who are in solid places in your on-air talent, because at the end of the day, production matters, and that's why your Quake failed, because they didn't have the best production value as far as getting the competitive gaming content out there. Unreal Tournament, at the same time, its heyday was this UT99. Its versions afterwards of 2K3, 2K4, Unreal 3, and all that just didn't hit the same type of competitive level that its original game did. And so you lost that production value once you started having things like YouTube and Twitch and all that stuff. And obviously Epic Games is developing a crowd-developed game version of Unreal Tournament, and they have some ESL tournaments going on, which will be interesting to see how those play out long term. But getting back to Call of Duty, as I said earlier, having a new Call of Duty game out every year or almost every year, as far as the esports side, is definitely hurting it. Now, let's go back to Counter-Strike. Let's talk about how Counter-Strike in the last 2 years has really helped grow esports significantly. Because, obviously, with League of Legends and Dota, the MOBA scene did have a huge impact on esports growing to where it is today. But recently, there's been more success with Counter-Strike and first-person shooters from a transition to the mainstream media. We've had E-League, which has been an outstanding success. We're 5 weeks in, obviously, and it has been entertaining every single week, whether or not it was on Twitch for the first 3 days or on TBS for the Friday nights. And it's also exciting because you are starting to see it with partnerships with like Arby's and Buffalo Wild Wings, and you're seeing esports being shown in bars now, and to me that's exciting. Friday nights 10 p.m. at the sports bar, and you're seeing Counter-Strike on television, and to me, that's your biggest thing. If there's lots of people try to compare esports to sports, and in reality, there's lots of differences and there are lots of similarities, but I think the one defining thing that is we're trying to finally break that barrier is that transition to mainstream, to where it's commonplace for esports to be on, and not just on the computer but on TV as well. I think E-League has done an outstanding job of breaking that barrier through their partnerships and through the commercials that they run, but also by creating content that people actually want to watch, that people actually tune into. I know their opening weekend they listed they had half a million people tune in to that initial Friday night broadcast just on the TBS, let alone the Twitch viewers and the partnered TV stations around the world. So it is very interesting to consider how successful first-person shooters have become in esports recently. At the end of the day, first-person shooters are going to always have a little place in my heart, since I used to compete, over a decade ago. But that about wraps it up for this week's episode of Coffee and Scotch Esports Show. Thank you for tuning in. Check out more great content on esports.online, and like, share, and favorite this as you see fit, and you all have a wonderful day.